When it comes to quartz watches, Citizen EcoDrive is one of the best options available, and it's been a little while since I've taken a look at one. So I decided to remedy that and started looking for something interesting to bring on, which is harder than it sounds because there are a ton of Citizen EcoDrive models. But this one, with its beautiful multi-layered dial, really caught my eye.
This is the Citizen Calendrier, which I believe is just calendar in French. It's a very elegant multifunction with world time powered by an EcoDrive movement, which, if you're not familiar, means it's a solar-powered quartz-based movement with a rechargeable battery inside, which, even without light, should run for about 5 to 6 months when it's fully charged. And the battery inside of it should last the life of the watch, or at the very least, 10 to 20 years. And even then, it's a fairly easy fix to replace. But let's start and take a closer look at the watch. It's a very rounded case, which is polished stainless steel, and it is a larger watch, although in some ways, it's almost deceptively large. It might be because the dial is a little smaller and is surrounded by a larger inner bezel. But looking at the watch, I would think it's a little over 40 millimeters. But it's not until you put it on, or start measuring it, that you realize how big it is, especially the lug length. So let's get the dimensions out of the way. It's 44 millimeters wide without the crown, and 47 width. Lug to lug is almost 51.25 millimeters, and it has a thickness of 13, which for a quartz watch is a bit tall. Its straps are unusual at 23 millimeters, and it weighs a decent 91 grams. Now, the multi-layer dial is definitely the star of this watch, and it's quite beautiful and complex. The dial itself is an off-white eggshell coloring, with both smooth and lined textures. The hour and minute hands are in a Dauphine style, in light blue metallic, with lume applied, as well as a matching blue second hand. While I think the hour hand may be a little short, I like the length of both the minute and seconds hand going towards the outer end of the dial. On the specific watch, the second hand isn't quite lined up right, which is a little bit of a disappointment, but it unfortunately seems to be a little more common than you would think. Moving away from the center, you come to the subdials, the simplest being the date subdial at the 3 o'clock, with a matching one-sided blue metallic hand. One thing I don't like is how the 31 and 1 indicators at the top of the subdial seem to run together. Moving down to the 6 o'clock subdial is a 24-hour. If you're familiar, it's similar to how the Nighthawk's 24-hour hand operates, with each side of the hand being a different length, which lines up to the indicators you should read on the half circle. The shorter hand for the inner indicators, and the longer for the outer. This hand also has lume applied. The last subdial is at the 9 o'clock position, and it's for the day of the week, and follows the same half-circle style as a 6. Except its hand has no lume. And while the date is quickset, the day is not, and must be advanced by moving the hour hand past midnight. So moving further out, you have a chapter ring on an elevated platform from the main dial, which has applied metallic hour indicators, giving it some depth. One thing I do love is the 12 o'clock indicator and how it juts out over the platform like a diving board, hovering just over the main area of the dial, just above the Citizen logo. Again, giving the dial even more depth and a very nice complexity. Further past the chapter ring, the dial sinks back to the main level, with a crevasse that runs the length of the dial, which displays the city names for what Citizen refers to as a world time function. On a side note, I just really wanted to say crevasse. And that's where the dial stops. But far above it, you have an internal rotating 24-hour bezel in two-tone gray and white, with the colors also referencing day and night. Now the bezel is controlled by the crown at the 4 o'clock position, and it has a very nice smooth and controlled feel as you turn it. And above everything is a mineral crystal.
Now, if you remember, this is a solar-powered watch with a solar cell just underneath the dial. And in order for EcoDrive to actually work, the dial needs to be transparent enough for light to penetrate through to hit those cells. And bearing that in mind, this dial is quite impressive with all its complexity, depth, layers, and texture, yet still allows enough light to power it.
The regular crown is at the 3 o'clock position, and both crowns are the same size and shape, and are unsigned. The case also has a very tiny crown guards jetting out at the 3 o'clock, but that's more for shape definition than actual protection. Moving to the back, you have a standard EcoDrive case back, which has a slightly more brushed appearance, and the EcoDrive logo. Now this is also where it indicates the watch has a 100-meter water resistance, so rugged enough to be a decent travel watch. Overall, I'd say the finishing is good, with a nice smooth texture and no rough or sharp angles anywhere. So let's go over the world time feature. But let's be clear, it's not a GMT and it doesn't even track a second time zone. In fact, I think it's a bit limited. So how it works is you need to read the time on the 24-hour subdial, then rotate the inner bezel such that the city that represents your time zone and the current hour on the bezel line up. Then, find the city that represents the corresponding time zone that you want to know about, and then read the bezel indicator above it. So it will tell you the current time in another time zone, but you have to manually rotate the bezel to update it every time you want to do that. And this is my biggest overall complaint about the design of the Calendrier. A 24-hour bezel only has a limited usefulness without a 24-hour hand. And the thing is, this has a 24-hour hand. It's just on a subdial and can't really be used with that bezel. But if you swapped the second hand and the 24-hour subdial, where it became a small seconds subdial and a 24 hand on the main dial, this would really be a GMT watch, and that bezel would have much more usability. It's similar to the GMT Vostok that I recently looked at.
Now, I realize that that is a rather unrealistic expectation or request for this watch, as it would basically require Citizen to make an entirely new movement just for it, which would drastically raise the price of it. But I at least like to think that maybe someone thought about it or talked about it while they were designing it, as this case really would be perfect for a GMT.
So as long as we are talking about the quartz movement, I will say that this is one of the quieter quartz movements I've heard in a while. Or I guess I've just been looking at too many Timexes lately. Now, in some ways, it's silly to check the accuracy of a quartz movement, but I've regularly been doing it since I've run across a few bad ones. So this is running about plus 0.2 seconds a day, or around 6 seconds a month, which is good for quartz movement. So let's go over the loom, and there isn't a lot of it. Just on the hour, minute, and interestingly, the 24-hour subdial. It's not too intense, but it is there, and it has a very nice blue coloring to stand out a little. Now, this variant of the Calendrier comes with a blue leather strap with white stitching, and other than it being an oddly sized 23mm, it's quite good. The coloring contrasts beautifully with the white dial. The leather has a good texture and has a nice thickness. And more impressively, it comes with a signed deployment clasp, which seems quite good and has a nice responsive click when you engage it. Let's wrap things up with a wrist shot. Overall, it wears decently, but if anything, it's a little big. But it's not the width of the case that bothers me, but the lug width that makes it feel a little too long across my wrist. But if you have larger than a 7-inch wrist, I don't think it would bother you too much. Although one last note, it is a little difficult to manipulate the internal bezel when it is on your wrist. So long story short, it's a beautifully designed, well thought out dial that has the convenience and reliability of an eco-drive movement. So if you were looking to add an eco-drive to your collection, or just looking for something a little different, then this might be one you want to take a look at. My only real complaint about it, other than it being a little bit on the big side, is that I think the internal bezel is a little gimmicky and not all that useful, although it does aid in giving the watch a unique look. So for context, let's talk price. MSRP for the leather strap variant is around $375, but you can usually find them closer to $180. And I would say that that's probably on par with other Citizen multifunctions, most of which are probably using the same movement. Although in terms of other dress watches, there are a lot of options around that price, quartz as well as automatic. So the Calendrier is decently priced, but it's not a spectacular value by any means. And if you prefer automatics, well, you're probably not looking at an eco-drive anyways. And if you don't already have a Bambino, then one watch to check out is the Orient Sun and Moon. While it doesn't have the same look, the multi-pattern white dial does remind me of it.
Which also brings up an interesting question as to whether or not it really is a dress watch, as it's a little big and a little tall for a dress watch, and the internal bezel and the world time seem more appropriate for a pilot's watch or a travel watch. Perhaps it's something in between. But whatever it is, it definitely has a distinct and beautiful look. But let me know in the comments what you think about it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and until next time.